How did you get into the low carb, specifically running element or fueling element of all of this running stuff, endurance stuff? Because high carb is essentially gospel, and people seem to be pushing the carbs even harder than ever and higher than ever. So, how did that originally come on your radar? Were you high carb before and then you transitioned to low, or how did that play out?
Yeah, I was definitely kind of more traditional with my dietary inputs from an endurance athlete standpoint, kind of earlier in my running journey when I was competing in high school and college. And it really wasn't until I got into ultramarathon where I ever even gave a lower carbohydrate any thought. And it was basically just kind of a combination of things where I'd done my first like full ultramarathon season where I did more than just like one race. I'd done 350 milers in about a 9 week time frame. I was also teaching full time at that point in my life, so it was pretty crazy time of year where it was in the fall. So the school year had just started up. I had been, I was still training pretty high level, and then hopping in these 50-mile races on the weekends when I could get away and do them. And it just didn't seem sustainable at the time. I envisioned like, okay, if I did this every kind of season, would this be something I would continually bounce back from? And that didn't seem to be the case. So I was pretty open about what I needed to maybe adjust to make that the case, to make it sustainable or feel sustainable anyway. And I had also just been at the same time happened to be like listening to more podcasts. This is like back in 2011, so podcasts were like in their infancy for the most part, and it's pretty novel actually. Where I was like, oh wow, I can take this MP3 player out on this run with me, and instead of just running for 2 hours, I can learn something and run for 2 hours. And that's where I kind of came across like Dr. Finney and Dr. Volek's work, and they had just started leaning that more in towards some of their athletic side of things. So their book, Low Carb for Performance, was one of the first like real more academic pieces of information I read about this particular approach. So I was in an off season and thought, you know what? Like I knew like from just following the sport, like the best time to change anything drastically is during the off season versus in the middle of a race season or kind of peak training. So I thought, well, if I'm gonna give this a shot, do it now, see what happens. I can always kind of go back to what I'm doing currently if it doesn't work out the way I hope it will. So I employed a pretty strict ketogenic diet for about 4 weeks that off season, and then kind of started reintroducing more structured training later that year through these different training cycles or blocks where I might be in off season, I might be in base building phase, which is just a lot of low intensity running for the most part. And then there's speed work development, which could be 2 or 3 quality sessions per week where I'm kind of targeting intensities a little bit higher on the aerobic intensity spectrum. And then there's maybe like a long run development phase where I'm getting real specific to whatever the distance and intensity is of the race I'm training for. So what I found is that like strict keto didn't really feel optimal, at least for me, across that entire intensity spectrum. So I started bringing some carbohydrate back, especially around the higher intensity stuff. And that kind of landed me in more of a low carbohydrate approach versus a strict ketogenic one. If we're at least if we're looking at it through the lens of just like grams per day or a 4-to-1 fat to protein ratio type of kind of programming that you'll maybe see in some of the literature. So that worked really well for me though. Like I noticed that I had like better consistency and energy over the course of the day. I was sleeping better, which I think probably was the main reason why I felt like I was recovering faster. I think sleep and nutrition are huge with when it comes to recovery, and they're probably the two biggest pillars there are for that. So if you can get them to work interchangeably with one another, then you're just going to leverage that component a lot better. And then recovery is going to be faster. You can get better training in, or in my case, maybe make something that felt unsustainable start feeling sustainable. So yeah, so that kind of got me sold on that approach, and I just sort of fine-tuned it over the course of about a year and a half to up to 2 years to where I got to a point where I felt pretty comfortable with when to leverage carbohydrates, how much I would need in races at different intensities, and just kind of putting it through the test of a few different training cycles and races to kind of really get it narrowed down into what I thought was going to work well for me.
Nice, man. So how did that adaptation period go when you started to move into like the ketogenic diet, for example? Like, and also how low carb were you in order to be ketogenic? Because your activity level was so high, I would assume that it was higher than, say, the standard 30 to 50 grams.
Yeah, that's a great question. It was yeah, because my off season's not like, all right, put your feet up and sit on the couch for a month. It's it's like just I'm gonna be training at a lower volume, lower intensity than I normally would, and maybe remove quite a bit of the structure so that I'm not just stressing my body the same way I would during peak development. So even in that phase, like my carbohydrate input is gonna probably be higher than the average person trying to leverage a ketogenic diet. I was landing about at around 50 to at most up to maybe 100 grams per day during that phase. Um, that first month where I was kind of more of on a stricter ketogenic diet. And from a transition standpoint, I felt like it took about a month to feel like everything had normalized, where I would go for an easy run and it just felt like, all right, my pace and my intensity and my heart rate are all matching what they were before. Whereas during that month where I would go out for a run, I would notice, all right, sometimes it matched pretty closely to what I was doing prior, and other times I'd go out and it would be like I'd be running like a minute and a half to 2 minutes per mile slower at what felt like the same intensity. And, I assume that was more or less the body just sort of getting used to that sort of change in fueling approaches. But that started to like improve in terms of the frequency, or I should say infrequency, in which I would see days like that near the second half of that 4 week time frame. And then by the time I got to about a month, I was still just running easy miles at that point. So but it was consistent then. It wasn't something where I was like, I wonder if I'm going to be running my normal paces or a slower pace for this run or not. And that was kind of encouraging, at least to think like, okay, this is something that maybe I can continue to explore.
Very cool, man. And then as you moved into lower carb and not necessarily ketogenic, what would that lower carb amountish be for you?
Yeah, so what I ended up finding, I did a few different like trials with how to kind of program it from like, okay, I'm just going to raise the total carbohydrate up and then just kind of rinse and repeat that day after day. And that was a little less predictable for me in terms of how I would feel. So what I ended up landing on was like be a little more intentional with what you could maybe call like targeting the right fuel for the right specific task. And that essentially just meant like if I had a week where I had, say, two speed workouts, like a short interval and a long interval session, and then like maybe a long run with a little bit of like moderate intensity mixed in there, where there's these 3 sessions that kind of stand out as being a little more glycolytic than what a typical just easy run would be. And I would take like I would look at my carbohydrate intake almost from a multi-day standpoint then, and I would just like I'm just going to congest the majority of my carbohydrates that I maybe eat in the next 48 to 72 hours around these sessions that are going to demand that from me more. And then on days where I was like very low intensity or rest, I would be a little closer to maybe what I was in those off-season time frames with that like 50 to 100 gram mark. So usually what it would come out to be is like an average around maybe 150 grams of carbohydrates per day, but that could be like 50 grams on one day and 250 on another, depending on kind of how that workout structure was set up.
Did you notice any, like, I know you noticed differences in your sleep quality. Did you notice, it's tough to separate, but any differences in your recovery capability aside from the sleep potentially, or was that just too hard to parse out?
Yeah, that's always tough because you just don't know whether, like, when multiple things improve like that, it's like, or multiple things change like that, it's hard to know like what one drove it and what amount. So, I mean, there's all sorts of like, I guess, anecdotes out there in terms of what potentially could be going on with low carbohydrate diets and recovery. There's people who say, hey, my recovery improved. The problem with anecdotes is you can also probably find same with the sleep thing. Like I talk to people, I've got coaching clients who have struggled with sleep on low carbohydrate ketogenic diets. So it's like, what's going on here that's different for me versus them that is making this an improvement versus a regression, or what tweaks can they make, or what I make to kind of have a reversal of that sort of thing. So my general assumption is like for whatever reason, I was just putting my body in a state that was just more receptive to good sleep by the end of the day. And I was capitalizing on that, and that was probably the big driver. Um, so then it's like you can ask all sorts of questions there. I think it's just like was it the diet that brought in that sleep quality, in which case without the diet, maybe you don't get the good sleep quality and therefore the recovery doesn't improve. So whether you look at that as like a direct contributor to recovery or like a secondary contributor or something like that would maybe be the kind of the debate.
Yeah, I don't know if there's something going on specifically with the immune system in regards to lower carb diets. Like, I'm super curious. I find personally, if I go for a longer run, having carbohydrates that I tolerate really well the night before running fasted and then keeping the carbohydrates very, very low after training, I recover faster than if I was to say add more carbohydrate after that long run. It's interesting. I don't know, like sleep, who knows what's going on. I think the immune system is playing a role, but it's tough to say.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be something like that. Yeah, I also wonder too, because like when I look at carbohydrates, I sort of think of them as like they're this very like effective, very fast acting fuel source. So to some degree, if you find yourself more adapted to higher fat oxidation rates, then introducing additional carbohydrate above and beyond what you likely need could put you in a state where you're just come almost pressed to keep doing things that you maybe wouldn't necessarily
Mm.
do when you should be kind of transitioning into recovery and rest from the stimulus you were trying to do. Um, the counter argument to that would be like, well, if you're a professional athlete, you should be trying to maximize your output to whatever you can recover from, which then you can always ask that follow-up question. It's like, well, at what point can you force yourself to do more and presumably think you're recovering, but actually not in the long term, and then run yourself into trouble. So it's an interesting world.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Now let's talk about sources. So as you obviously your carbohydrate intake came up as you transition from more ketogenic to a lower-ish carb approach. What sort of food sources did you use to increase that carbohydrate intake?
Yeah. I've done a ton of different stuff over the years. It's sort of been something where in my early days I was very strict about it. I was like I was more or less against grains and even to some degree refined sugars unless it was like intra-workout or something like that. And I was doing a lot more like fruits and starches, like potatoes and things like that would be like the primary input. Um, I think there's probably some argument towards certain carbohydrate sources being better than others at certain times, but I don't know that it's maybe as narrow of a list as maybe I originally thought in those early days. So since then, I've sort of opened that up a little bit where if I'm targeting a certain amount of carbohydrate for a specific workout or something like that, I'm a little more relaxed on where that source is coming from. And then on top of the other thing I've considered too is just like there is an application to on race day if I'm going to be eating something or drinking something, exposing my body to it prior to that is going to likely make it easier on it to be able to actually process and use that as a fuel source versus me saying like, okay, I'm never going to have like it sounds kind of silly, but when you get in these longer runs, you kind of have like a contrast between like kind of sports products that people probably imagine people are using in like marathons and stuff like that, like gels and sports drinks. But then you get to these longer events, sometimes you want to mix in some solid foods and something that has like a palate variance. So things as simple as like a saltine cracker or a pretzel or a potato chip. And it's like, not the type of food I would typically eat, but it is something where like, well, if on race day I'm going to be using like pretzels or crackers or something like that as a carbohydrate source to contrast any of the more kind of liquid gel type fueling products, then I probably want to have some of that in my dietary protocol before the race itself, so I'm not taking them for the first time in months and finding out in the middle of the race, oh, that was a terrible idea. Now I have a massive digestive issue and have to, deal with all of that. So some of that's a little more seasonal though too, because it's like I'm not racing like every month of the year. So it might just be like, okay, I have a race coming up in 6 to 8 weeks. Maybe I'll shift some of my carbohydrate sources over to some grain-based stuff to kind of accommodate what I'm going to be doing during the race itself. Or the other way to look at it too would be when I'm doing longer runs during that phase of training. For some of them, I'm going to be doing practicing my intra-race fueling strategy, in which case I'd have an opportunity to use some of those during those more specific time frames.
Okay, and are there specific sources of, supplements, whole foods versus, simpler carb sources, crackers, chips, stuff like that? Have you found a certain set of foods that work quite well for you versus foods that don't?
Yeah, like in races or just in day to day?
In like fueling for runs, like intra run, causing digestive distress versus not, for example.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I find that I don't have too many trouble with things just outright, but there are definitely thresholds, and those thresholds, if crossed, will cause problems. So, like, if I'm doing a fueling strategy, and I'm getting like maybe a little too heavy on like the fructose side of things,
Hmm.
that's going to potentially cause like a digestive issue for me. So, I tend to like make sure that when I'm taking in a carbohydrate source, I'm getting some balance between different carbohydrate sources, so I'm not kind of overrunning the threshold of any like specific one of them. Most of the sports products are because this isn't just a me thing. This is a human processing limitation thing. So like when we get to, I mean, some of these things have been challenged in recent years in terms of like how much you can actually tolerate and digest. It's still highly debated as to what's actually going on because it's not clear that they're actually processing and using some of those higher carbohydrate fueling strategies during the race itself. But there are going to be some problems where if like someone has like a skewed balance between glucose and fructose towards where they could get a digestive issue because they just aren't processing it quick enough and they're leaning too heavily into one or the other and finding that stuff. But I think for me too, one of the other like reasons I got curious about a lower carbohydrate approach versus just sort of trying to troubleshoot in a different direction was when I was doing some of those 50 milers. I was doing a pretty high carbohydrate fueling strategy for those. I was probably hitting close to 80 grams per hour during those races. And I was noticing that like I would get to the end of the race without anything that was like really hindering my performance that I was aware of anyway. But I was also noticing that by like the last maybe fifth to quarter of the race, it was getting more and more difficult to be able to kind of execute that fueling strategy where I just feel a little more like problematic digestively, like kind of building up there where I felt like if I had to do this for a whole nother 50 miles, and at that time I hadn't done a 100 miler, but that was the goal was to start doing 100 milers in the near future. So it seemed like I was questioning whether that was going to be possible. So my thought then was like, well, if I can lower my intra-race fueling demand, then maybe I don't need 80 grams per hour. And if I don't need 80 grams per hour, then possibly I can get to 100 miles on a lower input and not deal with potential risk with digestive stuff. So, um, to kind of go back to your question, I guess is like to me, I think it's less of a what is it and more of a if I'm starting to push certain thresholds of total intake, that's where a lot of the problems start to arise. So, like for me, when I ran my fastest 100 mile, I was averaging right around 40 grams of carbohydrate per hour, and that was spread out pretty evenly over that hour. In like every 20 or 30 minutes, I would have about half of that, and then uh, just kind of it was all liquid for that particular race, but it was like totally climate controlled, so it was a little easier to lean on liquid calories for that specific event. But yeah, it was like, I'm just not going to get a digestive issues from just about any carbohydrate source at 40 grams. The biggest question at that is like, if I'm running the paces I was running at that event, which were about 9 miles per hour, it was like just a little easier to do it through liquid versus chewing on something. So I went with that route for that particular event.
Yeah, the practicality piece is really important too. Now,
Yeah.
the whole digestion thing fascinates me as far as in the endurance world specifically, because it almost seems like it's par for the course for runners to have like bad digestion or just digestion issues. It seems to be so touchy. Um, are a lot of your clients coming to you because they're having issues with just higher carb and digestion in general, or is that something that you're seeing fairly consistently?
Yeah, and it's actually interesting. They do have some research on this too, where they looked at digestive issues during single day ultras, and the report suggested that about roughly half the participants are going to have some form of digestive issue, and then of that half, they're going to range from mild to severe, with about half of that half being severe. So, when you look at that, you're like, well, a quarter of the people out there are going to not just have like a little bit of a stomach ache that they can maybe persevere through, but like actually be in a situation where, their race is really slowing down due to digestion, not necessarily their fitness. And one thing I always talk about with my coaching clients is like, we don't want a situation where you get to the race and the finish line and you're like, man, I was so fit and everything was ready, and there was this non-fitness related thing that limited me from getting to where I wanted to get. So I would put digestion into that category. So yeah, there are a lot of my coaching clients who come to me because they're interested in that side of things. I would say most ultra runners that are looking to hire a coach are probably interested in that in general, regardless of whether they go to me or somebody else, just because it is such a big component of the event. And like what I oftentimes see with people is we get this we sort of get, I mean, we get what we get, right? Most people are paying attention to people who are in the sport and they're following friends, they're following some of the top runners in the world or in the country or at a race, and they're looking at what are these people doing, and they're getting these numbers of fueling targets from these people, and they're saying, okay, well, if that's what so and so did, it worked for them, I'm going to try it. Problem with that is it sort of ignores the context of the situation, where the way I like to look at it is you want to look at these things through workload, and then as much as possible apply that workload to your own metabolic needs. So if we take, for example, we just take basic research, where if we look at research of someone on a moderate to high carbohydrate diet, they're going to be burning about 50-50 fat and carbohydrate at their aerobic threshold, or what some people would consider like the top end is zone two. So it's like that crossover point between what would be an easy intensity into a moderate intensity. Most people doing like a 100-mile race, they're not going to be crossing over into the moderate intensity. They're going to be wanting to keep things under their aerobic threshold for the majority, if not all of that race. So we can sort of look at that 50-50 window for most people as like the absolute highest carbohydrate ratio that they're going to demand from their body during that race. And then if we look at kind of what their goal finishing time is, and then figure out what it's going to take from a mile per hour standpoint or kilometer per hour standpoint, we can start looking at workloads. So let's say somebody's trying to average 4 miles per hour, let's just say a little over 4 miles per hour, because they're trying to break 24 hours in a 100 mile, which is like a kind of a goal with a lot of ultra runners. Like I want to break 24 hours in the 100 mile. So they're probably going to be demanding somewhere in the neighborhood of around 500 calories per hour at that workload. And if we look at it through that lens, then we know like, well, if let's just say for simplicity's sake, let's take the most aggressive need that they're going to have, which is a 50-50 split between carbs and fats. Well, they're going to need 250 calories of carbohydrate to supply that side of the energy demand there. So, they're looking at like, 50 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. Now, that's a moderate to high carbohydrate diet person. So, if they're looking at what like the top runners in the field are doing and trying to apply that, they're going to look and say, oh, well, that person's taking in 100 grams per hour. Maybe I should try that. Problem with that is that person is probably running twice as fast as them.
Yeah.
So, so they may actually demand with that same math close to 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour, but their workload is twice as large. So the other way to think about it is that person that's finishing in 24 hours versus the person finishing in 12, they may have a scenario where they're eating the same amount over the course of that 100 miles, but one person has to jam all that into 12 hours, the other person has 24 hours to spread it out. So you want to look at it through that lens. And then you get into like my world, where I'm following a lower carbohydrate diet, therefore skewing those ratios of fats to carbohydrates in favor of fats across the aerobic intensity spectrum. And you get a different set of numbers to use in that equation. So if you take me, for example, when the last time I went and got my fat oxidation tests done, I was like 80 to 90% fat, 10 to 20% carbohydrate, kind of around that aerobic threshold target. So for me, rather than applying a 50-50 split to my fueling needs, I'm applying like an 80-20 split from fats to carbohydrates. So if I'm working with someone that's also on a low carbohydrate diet, we're going to assume they're probably closer to that than they are the moderate to high carbohydrate. Or if they went in and got a metabolic card test done and got those numbers themselves, we can look exactly, and anyone can do this. You can go into either a commercial or a university lab and get this stuff tested. And then whether you're high carb, moderate carb, low carb, ketogenic, it's going to tell you what your carb and fat rate ratios are at different intensities. And if you can pinpoint your race day intensity on there, you kind of know what your fueling demands are going to be from the carbohydrate side of that equation and start kind of plugging or playing with stuff. So I think a lot of the digestive issues with ultra runners is just because they don't have that data or they haven't explored that data and they're just applying something that's totally off base. And since it's totally off base, they're getting the experience that you'd expect when you're not on target with something. Or the other thing will be somebody tries to look at it through a little too wide of a lens, and they're like rolling into aid stations and eating a ton of food, and then they're going like a long time without eating again. So it's like maybe they're hitting the right numbers, but it's like a bolus and then a scarcity, and that's just not going to be as ideal for digestion, which in these type of events are going to favor like just nibbling on things versus eating big amounts and then going a long time without.
Yeah, that was a beautiful explanation. Now, 80 to 90%, I think you said that your fueling strategy is coming from fat as opposed to carbohydrate just below that zone two or the top end of zone two rather. What are some of those fat sources that you're eating while you're out there?
Yeah, so during a race itself, I mean, if it's long enough, I'll introduce some fat sources. But if it's something where, like that race that I did, my fastest 100 mile at, where I ran 11 hours and 19 minutes, I didn't eat any fat during that race because my assumption there was this is short enough where I don't really need it to maybe help with digestion. I don't really need the variance in fuel. I can pull that right off of my body. And one thing that I think people sometimes don't always understand is like, they'll see some skinny endurance athletes like, oh, they don't have any body fat to lose. It's like, well, they actually have tens of thousands of calories of body fat that they could tap into for a single day race. Now, they may be really lean and not want to lose that in the long term, in which case then I would suggest like after that race, eat a bunch of fat and get back what you lost. But it's not like it's not a short-term necessity the way the carbohydrates are. So when I have a race like that where I just really want to minimize the amount of stress I'm placing on my digestive system, I'm just probably not even going to introduce a fat source, and I'm going to worry about replacing that after the race itself versus trying to do it during it. If it gets a little bit longer, I mean, the recommendations actually suggest that you should have like a 75 to 85% carbohydrate and a 15 to 25% coming from like fats and proteins. Um, and that's the recommendation for just an ultra runner who's likely going to be on a moderate carbohydrate diet. So, you could say like, well, if the carbohydrate demanding runner is going to be able to introduce fats and proteins during their ultra marathon, then why wouldn't a low carber? And I think that's a fair question to ask, but I usually look at it through the lens of like how are we applying this in terms of like the duration. So if it's something where I'm going to be getting out there, I'm going to be out there for much longer than say like 11, 12 hours, like I am on these really controlled 100 milers, then yeah, maybe I will introduce a little bit of a fat source. Some of that just kind of comes along for the ride though, where it's like if I go into an aid station and have like some crackers or pretzels. There's going to be trace amounts of fats and proteins in that. It's not going to be 100% carbohydrate there. Or, I might have like something as simple as like a salty cheese quesadilla or something like that, or something with avocado in it where I'm going to get a little bit of fat and a little bit of protein from some of the solid food options that are just like at aid stations. And I tend to be a little more intuitive with those where it's like if my body's craving that stuff, if like I'm going in there and saying like that looks really good, I'm not going to resist it. I'm going to be careful about how much I eat at once because the way I describe it is whatever you think looks like enough, about a quarter of that's what your stomach's actually going to feel like. So, like if you looked at a sandwich in an aid station, you're like, I think one sandwich seems about right. Eat a quarter of it, take the rest with you if you want to, and then wait for that first quarter to settle before you start reintroducing the rest of it because your stomach is going to feel like it's got the full sandwich in it if you do a quarter of it or what you assume it will. So nibbling and sipping is kind of the strategy that I think is wise with these things, regardless of whether you're doing carbs, fats, proteins, solid foods, liquids, gels, or whatever else there is for people to eat during these things.
So you're essentially just going by feel as far as what you want or what your body wants and adjusting on the fly that way.
To a degree, I what I like to do is like I have like a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C, where like plan A is going to be something that's been tested thoroughly and I prefer it, and it's like I assume that's going in, my intuition is I could just do that the whole time. Plan B is going to be something that I've tested quite a bit, but it's maybe not my primary option, but I like to have it there in case I just decide for whatever reason I would rather have that, or if plan A is just not sitting well for one reason or the other. Plan C is one where it's like maybe I won't touch that at all, or um, I hope to not to touch that at all, but it's there and it's available, so I'm not trying to troubleshoot without any options. And so there's structure there, but like within that structure, there's some variety. So like when I ran my fastest 100 miler, I really didn't deviate from plan A at all, spare like I think one aid station transition. And then but I've had other races where it's like I'm moved on to plan C like early in the race because for whatever reason it just felt better to go with whatever I had planned in that department. And really the targets I'm trying to stay consistent with are just like those gram of carbohydrate targets just so I'm making sure that I'm supplying my body with that side of the energy expenditure so that I don't find myself at the end of the race feeling like I'm a little more flat because I dove into that a little too deep without replacing it.
Okay, gotcha. Gotcha. And are your carbohydrate intake amounts, in that 30 to I think 40, 50 grams, something like that you said earlier? Is that the case?
Yeah, yeah, mine are gonna be like because if you just look at like my workload, say you take my fastest 100 miler, my workload there is probably 800 to 1,000 calories per hour, or around 9 miles per hour. So if you think of it through that lens, then I'm going to be wanting to replace about 20% of that with carbohydrate, and that's going to get me to around that maybe like 40-ish gram target number to take in to do that. So it's like I could go up to 80, but I don't necessarily need it based on my charts. So I'm tempting digestion for maybe some unproven benefit. I could go lower and assume maybe I can do better than this, or maybe my body will make some transitions over the course of running 100 miles that favor fat oxidation. But I'm also risking then like getting to mile 85 and thinking, okay, now I feel like I'm working way harder than I should because I was just falling a little bit short. And I usually determine like if the data suggests this, let's stick to it. And then from there, like I can just respond to what my body's willing to tolerate. And for me, like 40 grams of carbohydrate per hour is it's just super unlikely I'm going to have a digestive issue that's relative to that. That's just a pretty low intake amount that I have found to be very sustainable for quite a while. So I haven't really ever been fearful of going up to 40 grams. Um, in fact, I could probably safely go up to 50 grams in most cases, and maybe even 60 without really risking digestive issues. But I also don't necessarily see a benefit from that. If I were to like start employing like a higher carbohydrate, moderate carbohydrate diet in my day-to-day life, then yeah, I'd want to be stressing those higher numbers because then all of a sudden my fat ox rates would probably shift to favor closer to what we'd see in the standard literature of that 50-50 split.
Totally. Yeah, no, if someone's listening to this and they're like, okay, this sounds kind of cool. I don't necessarily want to rely on pounding carbohydrates, my entire run, but they are right now. How would you recommend that someone sort of transition into this lower carb model?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great point. The thing I usually share with people in the beginning is don't get too myopic with fat oxidation rates being just completely dependent upon your dietary habits. You can improve your fat oxidation rates through a variety of things. In fact, just going out and training for an endurance event is going to improve your fat oxidation rates because even someone on a really high carbohydrate diet, let's say they're doing something pretty extreme like an 80-10-10 or 95-5 or something like that, with carbohydrate being the primary macro, they're still going to be, their body is still going to want to improve fat oxidation rates if they're out training at low intensities, which if you're doing an ultra marathon, you're going to be training at a lot of low intensities. So it, like they're making a step forward with that as well. And then if they want to improve that additionally, without actually changing their macronutrient intake. They can do that by just maybe positioning their carbohydrate during certain things. So maybe they do a couple runs during the week where they go out in the morning, they don't eat beforehand, or if they do, they eat fats and proteins versus carbohydrates, and they encourage their body to improve fat oxidation rates through leveraging like an overnight fast and then speeding up their metabolism and upregulating all the metabolism demands from their morning run. And that'll improve their fat oxidation rates versus them waking up in the morning, hitting a bunch of carbohydrate before and during, which is going to be less encouraging for their body to demand fat as a fuel source. Those are going to be relatively small levers compared to dietary shifts, though. So, like, and they may already be doing both of those. They're certainly doing the training one most likely. So, if they've come to the conclusion at that point, hey, I need to lower my carbohydrate demand in race day, that's where I think the reduction in carbohydrate intake is going to make a difference. But there's stages and steps to that as well, or endpoints that are going to vary from one person to the next. And some people are like maybe under the assumption, okay, I need to employ a strict ketogenic diet and really ramp up fat ox. Well, there's trade-offs there too. Like if the almost complete reduction of carbohydrate, which is going to be more or less necessary for a strict ketogenic diet, is going to put you in a situation where you're really basically eliminating that macronutrient, and therefore, how much are you going to be able to tolerate on race day by bringing them back during that? And you may get mixed results. So what I usually tell people is any reduction is going to improve fat oxidation rates. So like it's a spectrum. So if you think of it like a spectrum and we're moving down on it, say someone's eating like a diet that's closer to like, I mean, a typical ultra runner is probably eating like 60, maybe 65% of their diet from carbohydrate. So let's say they decide, all right, I want to improve my fat oxidation rates, but I don't need to do anything drastic. I just want to make sure I can get through this race with taking in maybe 20 grams of carbohydrate less than I normally would. They could probably just lower to say like 40%, and their body's going to improve fat oxidation rates because of their energy demand over that course of the day. They're going to have 25% less of that coming from carbohydrate and coming from fat instead, and their body's going to start prioritizing using that fuel source. If that's not enough, maybe they go lower and they work their way down. So sometimes I just encourage people to kind of like consider that, like where's your goal here and what are you trying to achieve from it? Um, because I'll have other people who come in and they're like, well, I'd rather fuel. My goal is to fuel as little as possible during the race. Well, in that case, we're probably going to want to get you down closer to a stricter ketogenic diet so that you're just basically fueling on really small amounts. We do have some really interesting research that came out recently where they looked at performance on endurance performance with ketogenic athletes. And what they did find out was there was an improvement on time to failure with an input of about 10 grams per hour, which they distributed in about, I think it was like every 20 minutes, they did a third of that 10 grams. Super small amount, but a very noticeable improvement. I think it was up to like maybe 25% improvement. So
Wow.
what that told me is if you're a ketogenic, I think these ketogenic athletes were right around 50 grams per day. So they were pretty much on even by a gram standpoint, a ketogenic diet, input their lifestyle, and I'm sure their fat oxidation rates were through the charts. But, they had an improvement with 10 grams of carbohydrates. So that tells me like, if you're looking at race day through the lens of, I'm going to try to have no carbohydrates, you're probably going to have a deficit in performance there, even if you're on a strict ketogenic diet. So 10 grams is maybe the starting point if someone wants to minimally use carbohydrate. Uh, and then I think like you can probably do some tests on your own or with a coach or whomever to kind of tease out whether you want to go more than that or not, and then determine like what the likelihood of the need is there. Um, I did speak. There's a guy named Matt Carpenter over in the UK, and I like him quite a bit because he actually doesn't do a low carbohydrate diet, I don't think, but he's interested in it. And last I chatted with him, this may have changed, but last I talked to him, it was he said like, well, I'm kind of beyond this idea of like, because I mean, there's always the debate of like, oh, is low carbohydrate going to reduce performance, improve performance, neutralize performance, and then everyone argues about it. But at the end of the day, if people are going to do low carbohydrate ketogenic diets and also do endurance sports, we should have some protocols for those people because they may not, let's just say like they accept the fact, let's just say they accept, all right, this low carbohydrate diet is going to, it's going to reduce my potential performance. Um, I don't care. It's the lifestyle I want. So I want to find my best path forward within this lifestyle. Well, they need a plan because they're not going to deviate from that and apply the high carbohydrate fueling strategy plan. So he's looking at it through like, well, what do these people need? So he's like with the studies he's done and the people have come through his lab. I think what he said was like it's usually like he sees a lot of these low carb runners doing somewhere in the neighborhood of like 30 grams per hour was a pretty consistent spot. So a lot of times when I'm working with people, we're looking at it through sort of that lens where it's like minimally you probably should be getting 10 grams, but if we can get you up closer to 20, 30 grams, there's potential that you'll see some benefit from that. And it's unlikely you're going to have a digestive issue at that. Uh, Maybe if you're on a strict ketogenic diet and you're not touching carbohydrates hardly at all versus trace amounts you're getting through like non-starchy vegetables or something like that, then it would stand that you'd be want to be mindful about going too much beyond that 10-gram number. Um, but at least we got ballpark figures to start practicing because at the end of the day, regardless of what your dietary habits are on day to day, you're going to be doing long training sessions at the end of your training plan when you're getting close to the race itself. And you're going to want to be practicing what you're going to be doing during that from a fueling standpoint, a hydration standpoint, electrolyte standpoint, what pack you're wearing, gear you're using, and all that stuff, just so you're not like learning about what works and doesn't work in the race you've been spending all this time training for.
Yeah, man. And I mean, if someone's following a ketogenic diet and they like that in their day-to-day life, but they can add like a banana per hour and improve their
Yeah.
performance by 25%, that is insane.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really cool because it was like before that study. I mean, we've had a lot of studies on like carbohydrates and performance and things like that, but we just don't have nearly as much on how that actually applies to someone who's on a low carb ketogenic diet and maybe where some important figures or starting points are at. So it's really helpful for me as a coach too, because now if like someone on a strict ketogenic diet comes to me and they're like, "Hey, I'm eating 30 grams of carbohydrate per day. Should I take in fats during my race? Should I take in protein? Should I take in nothing? What should I do?" We can pretty safely assume like, well, if you can wrap your head around it, 10 grams per hour is probably a really, really sound starting point. And let's just test that and try it. And then if they notice, which, at a 25% improvement, assuming that research is reproducible and turns out to be accurate, they're going to probably notice a 25% improvement. Like it's not going to be something where it's like, I did the 10 grams and I didn't really notice anything different than no grams. That's probably going to be something where they noticed like that they felt a little better on that run when we're getting into that sort of an improvement percentage. And usually if it's something like that where they notice that, then we can say, okay, well, what we got out of that, do we want to try 20 grams? And then maybe they try 20 grams and they notice no additional improvement. Well, then maybe we stay with 10 grams as their baseline, or have them do 10 grams as a baseline. And then if they feel like their energies are dipping for one reason or the other, when they get into some of these like longer hours that they're not doing in training out on race day, just be open to kind of supplementing that with another 10 grams or something like that in those particular moments. Um, or maybe they notice they get more benefit from 20 than 10. Well, we know that we're maybe getting a little closer to their personal like intake optimization number than we were before, but at least we have a good starting point to kind of like get that process started.
Yeah, man. Now, as far as fasted training goes, how often are you implementing that with yourself as well as your clients? Is it just more so preference? You're ramping up those fat oxidation rates, all that sort of good stuff. How are you thinking about fasted training?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm actually less. I think fasted training is something where first and foremost, if that person is at their ideal body weight, like that's where they want to be, they're happy with it, it's healthy, everything is going in the right direction with it, then we want to be more concerned with making sure that they're not inheriting a caloric deficit that is going to yield negativity in terms of performance improvements. So the hard thing with like endurance is you're revving up your metabolism, and then if you're doing fasted exercise, say in the morning, you're also shortening your window of time to eat. So not only are you taking in more energy or you're acquiring more energy to maintain your lifestyle, you're also shrinking the window in which you can get that in. So usually we look at like, let's make sure that that's dialed in first. And if it is, and they can kind of still hit their energy needs for the day with some fasting, I usually look at it as a preference standpoint because if someone's on a low carbohydrate diet, I'm not as concerned about them doing fasted runs because they're already leveraging their fat oxidation rates. If anything, we're just like, all right, well, let's just not eat carbohydrates before certain runs. And then, you're not inheriting that big calorie deficit through the course of that experience, but you're also still actively working on fat oxidation rates if you want to kind of keep doing that. Um, yeah, and I mean, in terms of frequency, I think it's something where a lot of times I'll look at it through the lens of like performance, where it's like, what are we trying to achieve with this workout? So, say it's a workout where it's relatively short and it's low intensity. I mean, that's a pretty good opportunity to do it because it's like you're not going to be in a situation where it's likely going to compromise the goal that you're trying to get out of that particular workout versus say I'm having to do short intervals on the track. Do you really want to wake up first thing in the morning, do a warm up, do this workout and get to your first carbohydrate or fuel in general in some cases after that hard session? Maybe not the best time to do it when we're looking at performance being met at a higher bar than we would be for that easy run. So a lot of times kind of the workout description will kind of guide to some degree whether it's something we want to entertain or not.
That makes a lot of sense, man. This has been awesome. Where can folks find out more about you, follow you on socials, your coaching, all that good stuff?
Yeah, yeah. The main spot to find everything is just my website at zachbitter.com. That's where I got my coaching, podcast details, um, whatever else I'm up to for the most part. I'm probably most active on Instagram and X, which is at zachbitter on Instagram and at zbitter on X. But yeah, my website's got everything to like my newsletter, coaching, all that stuff. I'll be coming out with an app here in the next few months too that will have some kind of fun if you want to kind of get into running and follow some structure and get some advice from me via that. That's coming out soon.